about Stimulus.js, and it is a JavaScript micro framework. And this is me on the internet. This is a picture that I've chosen to represent myself wherever I look like online. So that's me. I am David Kimura, and you can find me on Twitter at Cobalts. That used to be my World of Warcraft handle for my guys, so that kind of stuck around years later. I work for Sage. I've been a developer there for almost 10 years now. So definitely seasoned, but I learned quite a bit because I'm on the Ruby Rogues podcast. And every week we record a new episode, interview people, learn about new technologies and stuff. And I also keep up to date with my Ruby skills by doing Drift and Ruby screencasts. So it's a online screencast, think Railscast, where you can go and watch a short to semi-long video on Ruby-based stuff. And I'm actually running a promotion for the Atlanta Ruby group where you can sign up for $9 a month opposed to the $15 using the ATL RUG code. So why another JavaScript framework? And so with Stimulus, there are already Angular, React, Vue, Ember, a lot of other well-known JavaScript frameworks. So why do we need another one? And the biggest difference from this one from every other framework is that this one will only manipulate existing DOM elements on a page versus React and Angular and Vue being full-fledged client-side frameworks. So as DHH said in a Ruby Rogues podcast back in December, think of this more like JavaScript sprinkles to your Rails application. So you're still going to use your action view, all the views, routes, and everything within a Rails application. However, when you need to have interactive components that are existent on the page, then you're able to do that with Stimulus. So I'd like to give a little pre-recorded demo where we can select a state, and from that state, it automatically populates the counties. And from the counties, once you select one, it'll then populate the cities for that county. So this is a good example of how you can manipulate existing DOM elements on the page to update it to give it a more rich experience versus having to wait for the server or to just scroll through every single city and state available. So I think that there were 30,000 cities that I picked to load into this database, and its overall runtime takes about 10 milliseconds to render each view. So you can check out the Stimulus Handbook, which does a good job of going in depth on a lot of its capabilities, and that's on stimulusjs.org, and /handbook is where you can access their documentation. And one thing about Stimulus that I'm not going to cover in this talk tonight is that Stimulus does have the ability to have state management. So you are able to store things within your DOM for reuse later. So to install Stimulus with a Rails application, you can first create a new Rails application like you normally would, and we're going to use Webpack to install Stimulus. So is there anyone who's unfamiliar with what Webpack is? No? Good. So use Webpack to manage your JavaScript assets. And once you're within the application, you can do a yarn add Stimulus. And yarn is a package manager for JavaScript and a lot of junk. So to add in Stimulus into your Rails application, it really is as simple as doing a yarn add Stimulus. It'll go through and it'll install all the dependencies that's needed. And then you can start setting up Stimulus within your Rails application. And because we are using Webpack, so within you can see it has some breadcrumbs up here at the top. Whenever you start a new Rails application with Webpack, it's going to create a app JavaScripts folder, and that's different from the asset pipeline that's usually in the app assets JavaScripts. So within the application.js file, you'll see at the very top in the reference to add a JavaScript pack tag to your layouts file, and that's going to basically include in all of the JavaScript files within this app JavaScripts. And so this is a bit of boilerplate code from the handbook about the Stimulus handbook, where it'll initialize and import in the libraries for Stimulus, and then you can start interacting with it. So I'm going to post a link to this Git repository so you can play around with it yourself, and also check out the handbook because it has a lot of really good information and some examples and use cases. So then if you go into your application layout file under the app view layouts, you can include the JavaScript pack tag application. And this will then include in all the JavaScript files from the JavaScript packs. So to understand really how Stimulus works, it's important to know really what makes up a controller or a component for Stimulus. So within this view, you basically have a data controller. And whenever you have a data controller attribute on there, that's going to basically trigger that you have a Stimulus component. And in this case, I have it called city selector. So all of the anatomy of the controller will go within this div element. So everything from the state that we had in our demo, the county, and the city are all wrapped within this data controller. I then have some form fields where you can select the state ID. And this state ID has some data attributes. So a data attribute for the target and a data attribute for the action. So the target references the actual input or dropdown, whatever the actual element is on that page. And you always have something like a city selector dot and then a name for that item or for that element. And in this case, because we named our data controller the city selector, we also need to target the city selector and then have a dot and then state input. So think of it kind of like an attribute, like a user.first_name. So this is your city selector dot state input. And from here, we're going to be able to interact with the state input by having that data target. And so now, whenever you have this component or your input that you're wanting to work with Stimulus, it needs some kind of event listener, and it's able to get the event listener through a data action. So we have a city selector, and then we have a pound, hashtag, or whatever you want to call the little number symbol, and a state changed. And so that state changed is going to reference to a function within our city selector JavaScript controller. By default, whenever you are working with a input, there are a few different elements. So on a link, the default event is going to listen on click. On a button, it's a click. When you submit your form, it's going to trigger the event listener. Or if you have an input or select text area, those are going to be triggered on a change. So in our case, we are working with a select area. So on our form select up on line 22, we are selecting the state ID, and we're getting it from a collection that we'll look at in a little bit. So because we did not specify the action, so down here, we're not specifying something like changed with a dash and a greater than sign. It's going to automatically assume that it's going to be triggering this function whenever a drop-down selection has changed. If you need to override this on maybe something like a focus, then you are able to just put in a focus dash greater than and then have it point to your city selector change. So it is really able to handle a lot of different scenarios. So then we have our county ID, which our county ID, once you select a state, it's going to populate all the lists of counties. So initially on a new form, you can see that I have the county ID as an empty collection. We're not loading it with anything. But we do have some data attributes again, and these are referencing to our city selector on the stimulus controller. And we have a county input for our target and a county change for our action. So once we have our county populated with a bunch of different counties, then whenever we select a county, it's going to trigger a function within our stimulus controller for the county changed. And similar for our city, but the city is a little bit different because we don't have a data action. Because once we select a city, once we have selected our county, once we have selected our state, there's nothing else that we need to do. We've gotten to our final step where a city has been selected, so we don't need to have any kind of data action on our city input. But we do have our target because once you select a county, once you select your state, your county, then we want to populate the cities, and in order to do that, we have to be able to target this element. And you'll see down here I have also a city ID, county ID, state ID. That's a really inefficient way to get the IDs for those. However, we will see why that's important later. And to give you a hint, it's when you go to edit a record that already has a city selected, that city is going to then need to populate the state and the county automatically, and we need to pass that information over to our stimulus controller. So now we're going to get outside of stimulus a little bit to see the makeup of this application, and we'll start at the routes, because whenever I'm investigating a new application, I think the routes is a good place to kind of start to see the entry point for the application and some of the different APIs available for that app. So this is a very simple one where we have a resource of accounts. That's our default page. We have our states, our counties, and our cities. So when we reference a county, we're going to have to provide a state ID so we can then get our list of counties. And even though it doesn't really show it here, we are only really going to be working on the index action of each one of these resources. And then in the controllers, we're really only going to have two different controllers. And these are really simple, very lightweight controllers. And their main purpose is to return the counties. So whenever you select a state, we're going to make a call back to our Rails application to get our list of counties that's applicable to that state. So on line 3, we are setting our instance variable for the state, where we can find the state based on the parameter that was passed in, and then we're getting all of the counties for that state. Again, we got some inefficient lookup here because we're not including the counties when we were doing the lookup, but for demonstration purposes, I wanted to keep it really simple. And then we are rendering a JSON response, and we're getting the counties and then the select collection. And we'll go in and look in the model to see what the makeup of that method is. And then in our cities, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's still on the same principle that once you have a state selected and you have a county selected, then you're able to then find all the cities that are applicable to that county. And then we are rendering the JSON for our cities and then the select collection. So overall, our routes and our controllers are very lightweight, and there's not much going on in them, and it's really easy to read and follow at this point. So then when we go to our models, if you've ever tried to do some scopes on attributes and stuff, it can get a little bit complicated, so I'll try to walk you through this. On our state model, we have many counties. Then we're going to have a scope, and a scope is basically a different way of writing a method where you can do self-dot. So think of it just having a class level method where you can sort all of the entries alphabetically, and then we have our scope for the select collection. So back in our controller, if you remember, we had a state.select collection, and this is where it's referencing. So the first thing that this is doing is getting the list of our states in alphabetical order, and then we're mapping through them, or we're just looping through each one of these, and we're creating an array. This array is going to have the name of the state. It's also going to pass in the ID of the state. And then we have this little bit of hackery here where we are generating a URL for our counties, and we're passing in the state. And the idea of this is that we are going to populate our drop-down list or our select box with the list of counties. So in order to do that, once we go to the next step, once you select a county, you then need to be able to find out what county is selected, then have some kind of URL that you can then request all these cities that are applicable to that county. So to do that, the URL helpers or the state county's path is not accessible within a model. And typically, I would not just put this directly into the model here. I would have some kind of form view or form helper that I would extract this into, because I want the models to really kind of stay true to working with the data and not so much collecting information for the view. But in this example, it's simple enough to just show you it like this. So then our county gets to be a little bit more complicated, because we now have a belongs to state and we have many cities. So a county will always be associated to a state via a state ID, and then it also has many cities, which the cities model will have a county ID. We then do the same thing where we are looping through, where we are getting the ascending order of all the counties, and then our select collection is going to be an array map, and this is doing something very similar. And you can see that I use a few different notations for defining a lambda, and whenever you have a scope, you can create a lambda function like this, or if you have one that's multi-line, then sometimes your Rubocop will say, hey, use lambda instead of that. So the map array is, yeah?
Does line 18 compile given an array helper inside a model without the full route separate URL helpers?
It does.
Really?
I think it does.
Yeah, I think map might be part of the active record API.
Map does, okay.
So that's actually a good catch. I did not see that one. I did not run into any errors when I ran the program.
Because at line 22 it just stood out.
Yeah. Yeah, it might have something to do with the map. So we're constructing our array for the select collection, very similar to how we did it for the states, where we are creating an array of the name, ID, and then a URL, which we're then able to then pick our cities from that URL. And I'm going to skip the, here you go. That city's path, that's a horrible name for a method, because right below we have another scope called city's path. So there's your answer.
That's why.
Yeah, so there's the actual getting the path. But because I was afraid for this presentation we would have not enough screen real estate to display a super long line, I just gave it a really horrible, confusing name right there. So.
That's clever.
Oop. Yeah, so do not name your scopes with like an underscore path, because it's going to be confusing. So, but then we are getting our URL helpers for the state, county, cities path. And to do that, you need to pass in a state ID and a county ID, both of which we have at this point. So we are able to then get our collection. And then the cities is going to be really simple, where we have many accounts. So our accounts model has a name, and it also has a city ID. We're not storing the county ID, and we're not storing the state ID on our accounts, because that information can all be looked up from just having the city ID. So our scope is, again, sorting it alphabetically, and then we are just performing our select collection, looping through that sorted array, and we then are just returning the name and ID. There is no need to return a URL here, because once you have a city selected, that's your final stop. So jumping back over to stimulus, now we're going to look at the actual stimulus controller. Initially, it's really simple. This is just the boilerplate code. And this, again, is in the packs. And I created a controllers folder and then created the city selector controller. So it's important to have this named correctly, the file, because where we had referenced the city selector, it's then going to look for a controller with a similar name. So all of our code is going to go into this class that we have. And the very first thing that you can do is you can have an initialize method so that you know that the action or the controller is being initialized. So if we were to run this, you're going to see the hello from the city selector controller, and it's going to just kind of work. If you went to a page that did not have the city selector controller, the div element, then it's not going to display this console log, but as soon as you go to a page that does have it, it'll actually display that in the dev console. So going back to our view or our form where we created the initial view for the controller, remember that we have these data targets and these data actions that we're going to be working with. And the first one that we're going to work with is our state. Because our state is the very first interaction that we're going to have with this controller, we need to get the state input and the state changed. So from lines 7 through 12, we added a state changed. So that references to the action. It's a JavaScript function, and it's referencing to the action that we had created within our view. And then we can get state. So we have getters and setters. So we're going to get our state, and we're going to return this .targets.find and the state underscore input. And that's how we're able to target that drop down for our states. So once we have our state and it's changed, then we are calling this state changed. And from that state change, I'm going to paste in this bit of code here. We're going to make a request back to our application. So this .request data, this is going to be a function that we create within the stimulus controller to make a AJAX call back to our application. So once we make the AJAX call back to our application, we're going to get a response from the application, and that response is going to be our JSON array of the name, ID, and URL for our counties. The first thing that I do once a state has been selected is that I want to blank out all of the options that are loaded into the counties and also the cities. So if you select a different state, it's going to empty out all of those options. I then create a blank option within the county. So we have, one thing I should explain first is this variable that equals this. Has anyone ever seen that or done that before? It's kind of a hacky way to remember what this is later so you can reference it as that. Because when we have an asynchronous request, like the request data is going to be an AJAX request back to our application, we're going to need to be able to then interact with elements on that page. And one way to pass that through is setting that is equal to this, and then reference that wherever within that response. It's a little confusing, but you guys will come across that one time or another. And I'm definitely not a JavaScript guru, so this is how I loop through an array of things. I will just loop through each item, and from that each item, I'm creating an option element. So every dropdown that you have, all those selections are option elements. And I'm setting the context to the first item of the array, and that array is again, the name, ID, and then a hash for the URL. I'm setting the value to the first element, which is going to be the ID. So whenever you see the dropdown, it's going to have your name and it's going to have the ID. And then I'm setting an attribute on that option called URL, and I'm setting that to the URL that we want to get. So that way, whenever we go to select a county, then we're going to have the URL that it needs to make a call for back to our application to get the list of cities. And then we are appending to the county the option on line 20. Everyone following that so far? Cool. All right, so here is that request data call. So whenever you create a new Rails application, you kind of get this freebie, unobtrusive JavaScript gem called the Rails UJS. One thing that a lot of people did not know about the Rails UJS is that you can make an AJAX call by calling rails.ajax. So instead of having to worry about vanilla JavaScript or import in jQuery just so you can do a $.ajax, you already have that available to you. And the nice thing about it is that it's going to support a success and a error callbacks. So back in the state changed, we passed in the URL, and then we also passed in the callback, which is really just kind of like a block that we were then doing all of that stuff, or a function. So if you haven't ever used the Rails.ajax and you have Rails UJS, I definitely recommend it instead of importing in jQuery into your application.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What triggers state change? Is that triggered from the binding to the element? What triggers?
Yeah. So stimulus is running, and whenever you have the data action, and then the city selector pound state change, that's how stimulus knows that whenever this element is changed, because you have the city selector, it knows what controller to reference, and then it knows what function to reference with the state changed.
Okay, so you manipulate, that was on like an input element, we can manipulate the input element.
Correct, yeah. All right, and then we need to create getters for our county and our city, and those are really just doing something very similar that we did for our getters for the state, where we're just referencing the data target and then the county input and also the city input. So the county changed, it is very similar to the state change because it needs to make a request out to the Rails application to get the list of cities for that particular county. And we have the county URL. So down here at the bottom, you can see where we have on line 30 and 40, we have this county. And so this county is referencing to that getter that we have. And it's going to get the first selected options. So if you had a multiple selection, then you would have to modify this. But we have just a single selection, so we're going to get that first item, and then we're getting the attribute URL, and that's what we had set in our state changed function. So once we have our URL, we're doing this same request data. We're making a call out to our Rails application, and then on line 28, you can see where we're just blanking out all the cities. So whenever you select a different state, we want to clear out the list of cities so that you can then make a new selection and select a different city. We're looping through each one of the items in our response, which again, this is going to be our cities, and it is the name, ID, and then a hash of the URL. And very similar to our state change, we're creating an option element, and we're filling in the value and the display or the content for that option value, and then we're appending it to our city. Notice we are not appending a URL because we do not have one to append, because once you have a city selected, there's nothing else to do. And so at this point, if we were to run our application, you would be able to select a state, you would be able to select a county, and then you would be able to select a city. But that's only half of the equation, because once you save that record, then you only have that city ID. You've lost the reference to the state, you lost a reference to the county, which means that you're not going to be able to fill those in. But in order to do that, as I mentioned earlier, that's where I created some other data attributes on the city. So if a city has been saved, and we're pulling up this record again, then we are setting the city ID, the county ID, and the state ID. So when we go to edit this record, ideally, we would want to have the state, county, and city already pre-selected so they can make changes to it. So back in our controller, in the initialize method, I created a function called checkForms. And this checkForms is referencing right below on line 8. It's checking to see if we have an attribute on our city called the data county ID. If we do have a data county ID selected, then we know that we are editing a record and we're not creating a new record, which there would not be a data county ID. And from here, we can set the state value to our data state, or data state ID. And that's referencing it from the city. So this one was kind of a freebie. There wasn't really anything that we had to do there. And then we can call a function for our state change, because we can't just simply set the county ID and the city ID, because those drop-downs, if you remember from our view, are empty arrays initially. There is no data in them, so we can't set them yet. We can't set their values. So I'm going to call these state change. So we're basically mocking that someone has selected a value, because just setting the value is not the same thing as changing the value. So I'm manually calling that the state has changed. And that's going to run our function in the stimulus controller for the state changed. And I just put in a bit of logic to where the 3 dots indicate all that code that we had before, where we were creating all of the elements. That still happens, but after all of that happens, within our callback of the request data, so once we have fetched all the counties, we set the county dropdown with the list of counties, and then we check if the city has an attribute for our data county ID. And if it does, we can assume at this point, because it was a successful response from our Rails controller, that we have the list of counties already populated, and that all happened right here at those 3 dots. Does everyone understand that that's not actually JavaScript code? That is just me cutting it out so you can see the rest of there. So once we have our counties populated, the drop-downs, we can then check to see if we have a county selected or a data county ID set on our city's data attributes. And the reason why I'm doing a check here, because we're using the same state change function for a new record and editing a record. We wouldn't want to set the value of our county to a data attribute if this is a new record, because that data attribute doesn't exist. We could get some quirks. But in this case, on a new record, it's going to skip this if function or this if statement, and it's going to continue on. But if we do have, or if we're editing a record, then it's going to go through this if statement. It's going to set the county's value. And just I found out that I had to remove the value from the city, just so whenever we are changing the state again, it's not going to try to come back into this to set the value back. So we had to remove it. So it's kind of a one-time change. And then we can set the inner text to null. Oh yeah. So we are going to then set the inner text of the cities to null, which is our list of cities. So that way we can then call the county change to kind of mock that the county was changed, because that is what we had just set. So now that we have our county selected, we can then go to our county change and do something very similar, where we're going to make the request back to our Rails application. We're going to get the list of cities. We're then going to check the city attributes to see if a city ID exists. And if it does, then we're going to set that value, assuming that the code right above that has successfully ran populating our list of cities. So does anyone have any questions? Everyone followed along and memorized all that? Yes. So again, I'm going to post a link for a GitLab repo where you can download this and kind of poke around and play with it. But for now, I'd like to give you a demo, an actual live demo, so you know that this stuff actually really works. And those are my kids. All right. All right, so I'm just going to launch the Rails application. I'm gonna go.
Two-way data binding, or is it?
Why do you need two-way data binding? I mean, come on, man.
Trolling you, I guess. It's not a WebSocket replacement.
No, it's not. So we have our list of accounts with a name and city. We can create a new account, and from here we can select a state. This state is already pre-populated because that is a known element that we always know what these lists of states are going to be. So once you select a state, we can then go and select a county. We select our county, and from there we can select our city. If we were to change our state, it automatically blanks out our county and our city. We can then select a different county in a different city and then save this. Once we save this, if we go back to edit it, it's already there. So this made the request back to the Rails application, and it got the data, populated it, it set the values. That is Stimulus. If we were to change our county, we can select a different city, or if we select our state, then we can select our county and our city again, and it all works the way it's supposed to. You should clap. It's exciting. All right, hopefully you'll keep my place. There is the link to the repo. So I chose to host it on GitLab, but it's under GitLab/cobalt/stimulus example. I see people typing it, so I'll give them a moment.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Are there use cases that you can think of where Stimulus would not be a good fit, like where it is more generative of the JavaScript on the like where you need to not rearrange things that are already on the page? And have you run into those cases? I'm sure they exist, but like have you run into specific cases of them?
You can always find a case or argument one way or another. Recently, I built a feature at work that Stimulus would have been nice to have, but this feature was overly complex where it just made sense to do it with a bunch of different UJS callbacks. But I think for a Rails monolith, this is a perfect fit, because you are able to manipulate the elements on a page. And personally, I think this JavaScript that we showed was a lot more pleasant to work with than doing a lot of vanilla JS and a lot of other junk. So, and I personally think that this is easier to work with than working with a React component. So again, if you want to sign up, this was actually a screencast episode that I did on Drift and Ruby. You can sign up for $9 a month using the Atlanta Rug coupon code. That's it. Are there, yeah?
Yeah, how to test the controller?
What's testing? Honestly, I don't know. There are some JavaScript libraries out there to do testing. I would imagine it would work similar. Other than doing feature tests with Capybara, I'm not sure.
Right.
So if I had to test it, I would probably go the Capybara route, just because I want to make sure all the interactions and click events are triggering the way I would expect it to.
Yeah.
Yes?
You return JSON from your API, and you have to do this work to convert the JSON back into HTML. Is there any reason why you couldn't return a Rails partial and just kind of take the entire string and enter HTML into the page without having to go through the conversion step?
You can. The problem with running Rails partials is there's overhead to it with calling and then running the ERB to get the actual HTML output. So on a few different partials, like if you had a partial for each option that you're adding in, there's going to be some more overhead. You may not see it on a small application or applications that have only 100 elements that you're displaying, but if you're going upwards of several hundred elements that you're going to display, then you may notice that this takes a lot longer. In this case, you saw how fast that worked. The actual response back from the controllers, if we look at, they're super fast. So there's very little server overhead, and we're putting that on the client side to do the work. Yeah, right?
Is graceful degradation still a thing, and what would strategy would you follow, for when JavaScript broke? Or
Tell them to download Chrome. And that,
JavaScript fan, use a better browser.
yeah, I have used NoScript, here and there, but on an application that's so heavily reliant on JavaScript, especially most applications today, having a good, well-oiled browser like Chrome or something is really important. Yeah. But no, I really don't know if there is any good alternative for degradation.
How you design your web app to fall back to work in a non-JavaScript state. That's all.
Yeah. I would say that you can then make a JavaScript request back to the application to populate all that stuff, but that really won't work.
Same thing. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there any other questions? All right. Well, hopefully that wasn't too technical for you guys, but it's something that I've been playing around with quite a bit, and I really enjoy working with it. So some other use cases, and one that's on the handbook on stimulusjs.org, is a copy button. So if you remember, anywhere from like 3+ years ago, in order to have a copy button on your web page, so like GitHub, where you have the repo URL and then you can copy the link, that actually has some Flash going on in the background. This is a completely Flashless way that you're able to have a copy button without having to have a little tiny Flash SWF backend. All right, well, thank you.